I'm Cali Black. I'm here to give you all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week we're studying Acts chapter 16 through 21. That is 6 chapters. This week we are focused all about Paul, and we are focused on his second and third missionary trips that we study. Last week we learned about the first missionary trip that Paul took, and he was companions with Barnabas for the most part. Remember, he had John Mark with them for a little bit, but mostly Paul and Barnabas. And you kind of got a taste of what it's like to read about Paul's missionary journeys. If you're reading about a missionary journey, it means there's a lot of places, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of things going on. And I just want to remind you, the purpose of these videos that I hope is a helpful resource to you is that I want to simplify things for you. So I am not going to talk about every single place and person. I want to give you like the quick overview of what happened and like here's the important event you need to know about and the important person that you need to remember. That's what I'm going to draw your attention to in these videos, and I hope that's helpful to kind of clear out all the stuff that isn't necessarily essential to understanding what's going on in the scriptures. I enjoy doing this. Now, if you are someone though who wants to dive into everything, that's what my study guides are best for. So if you're teaching seminary or Sunday school and you want to understand it all, or just for your own personal study and you want to know who all these people are in all these places, dive into the study guide. You'll get all that there. Here, I'm going to keep it simple so that you can focus on, oh, right, this is important. Okay, this is kind of just a list of stuff. Okay, this is important again. And that's what I hope to be able to give you a little bit of clarity. Okay, so second and third missions. These are actually the last missions that we learn about Paul. He did most likely, I mean, very, very assuredly, to the best of our knowledge, take one more missionary journey, his fourth mission, but it was actually after the book of Acts ended. So we're not going to be reading about the details of it, although we'll get glimpses of it in epistles, those letters that we read later on. So second and third missionary journeys, let's go. Paul's second missionary journey, we start off with right away. In fact, we got the beginning of it at the very end of last week's chapter. If you remember, Barnabas was like, hey, let's have John Mark come with us again. And Paul was like, I don't really trust him. So Paul is now with Silas as his missionary companion. Silas was one of those people that the elders in Jerusalem had sent with that letter being like, their decision from the Jerusalem council that they do not have to, converts do not have to follow the law of Moses anymore, including the law of circumcision. So there's great news to be had. Paul and Silas head out, they're ready, and boy, do they have tons of success now, especially with this new decision from the Jerusalem Council. Just to kind of keep timeline-wise, everything in mind, Paul most likely set out on his second missionary journey that we start reading about in the year 51. Okay, so just right after the Jerusalem Council, which was likely in the year 50. And then his third missionary journey that we read about this week probably started in the year 54. And then at the end of his third missionary journey, which is where we'll end this week, Paul goes back to Jerusalem, and that was around the year 58. So we're covering about 7 to 8 years in our studies this week. So long missions. When you're reading it, you're going to be like, oh, and Paul stayed here for 3 months and 4 months and a year and a half. And then here, like he was in this for the long haul. There was a lot of stuff going on in these missions, and it's pretty cool to see their success. So let's dive into the chapters. So we start with Acts 16, Paul and Silas heading out, and they actually go through Asia Minor. And as they're traveling through Asia Minor, Paul gets this distinct impression that they shouldn't preach to anyone there quite yet. Now, they already had previously, and in fact, they'll go back on the third mission and do it, but now was not the time for them. And they keep going, and Paul has a vision, a dream, and so this man from Macedonia comes in this vision and says, you need to come preach to us in Macedonia. And so that's where Paul and Silas head next. They head to Macedonia. As they're heading there, they meet a woman named Lydia. There's actually a group of women, they're at the river, and Lydia in particular seems to be a very, very important woman. Her role socially was just huge, and she seemed to be pretty well off as well. And Lydia is converted, she is baptized. And that kind of starts off a whole bunch of conversions that Paul and Silas are able to do here. When they're in town, Paul casts the devil out of this young woman. The problem is that young woman had masters who owned her, who were using her to make money by calling her a soothsayer. So as soon as Paul cast the devil out of this young woman, the masters got very angry, and in fact kind of got other people to get angry about Paul and Silas as well, and they ended up completely rioting and throwing them in prison for not any legal reason. Like, this was clearly an act of anger started from these masters. While they're in prison, they had been beaten. They were in really bad shape. There was an earthquake while they're in prison, and an angel freed Paul and Silas from prison, and the jailkeeper sees this happening, and he immediately is like, oh, I think they're onto something here. And Paul preaches to the jailkeeper, converts him, he's baptized. And then the magistrates in town kind of figure out what happened and are like, that shouldn't have happened. Can you let Paul and Silas go? And Paul says, I'm actually a Greek citizen. I have Greek citizenship. We don't know tons of background about Paul, by the way, but we're finding out now that he has Greek citizenship along with also being Jewish. And so he invokes his Greek citizenship and says, you cannot just throw me into prison. I demand you come down here in person and apologize and make everything right. And they do, and they are freed to go on their way. So we do learn that Paul has Greek citizenship, which right then and there became very helpful, and we'll see that become helpful again. Okay, moving on to chapter 17. They go to Thessalonica, they're preaching in the synagogue, they're having some success with a lot of the non-Jews, a lot of the Greeks, and a lot of the Jewish women, but a lot of the Jewish men are not liking Paul and Silas, so they end up running them out of town. They go to Berea. Those saints are like primed. They are ready to go. Lots of success in Berea. But then the people from Thessalonica, those Jewish men, start coming over and start causing trouble again for Paul and Silas. So they start to kind of travel around and split up. And this is when Paul goes to Athens. And while he's there in Athens, he meets with this group, and they go to a place called Mars Hill. And on Mars Hill, there was a statue that they had made that said, "To the unknown God." And Paul, there on Mars Hill, delivers this beautiful address where he talks about the statue to an unknown God. And he says, no, we know God, and we are the offspring of God. This is where we get just that powerful clarity on that doctrine, that we are the children of God. Beautiful speech that we get from Paul there. Unfortunately, it doesn't convert tons of people there in Athens, and he eventually leaves town. Chapter 18, we now go to Corinth, and Paul is staying there with some Jews named Aquila and Priscilla. And remember their names, because Aquila and Priscilla are this amazing couple that are very important to a lot more stories. So they are important. Remember those names, Aquila and Priscilla. They're in Corinth. Paul's staying with them for about a year and a half. Silas ends up joining up again. We also have Timothy. We haven't met Timothy yet. We get to learn about Timothy this week. He's going to be important. So remember Timothy, Timotheus or Timothy. He just becomes a great friend and a great preacher and disciple. So it's cool to see any little stories where Timothy pops up. They are preaching, but there's a lot of non-believing Jews in the area there, and they end up bringing Paul to their deputy. And the deputy looks at Paul and says, listen, I can't decide religious concerns. That's not going to be something that affects me. We then have Paul sailing. He's preaching. Lots of sailing going on, just heads up for that. And then we learn about this man named Apollos. Okay, Apollos was a Jew, so not a Christian Jew, but it's because he hadn't heard of Christianity. So he was a very devout Jew who knew everything, and he came to Corinth and he was preaching so passionately. And the couple of Aquila and Priscilla were there, and they heard Apollos preaching, and they're like, this guy needs to know the truth. He needs to know that there was a Messiah. And so they end up teaching and totally converting Apollos. Apollos becomes baptized, and he now becomes like a firehouse of converting all sorts of people to Christianity now that he knows that there's one more step, that there was the Messiah. And Apollos ends up going to Corinth and converts a whole bunch of people. Remember that. Lots of things to lock away in your brain this week. Chapter 19, we have Paul going to Ephesus. He's converting more people. Some people need to be rebaptized. They need to receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. So he's kind of like tying up some loose ends here. This, by the way, we've now transitioned to Paul's third missionary journey. The second missionary journey is chapters 16 through 18. And then the third missionary journey starts in the middle of 18 and goes to the end of 21. So we're now in the second missionary journey, the second that we're studying this week, which is Paul's third missionary journey overall. Hopefully that's clear. And he's kind of visiting a lot of the places that he had been before and checking in on them and seeing how they're doing. It's kind of like a check-in thing. But he's getting rejected a lot. But he's also able to perform miracles and have some success. There's this group of, they call them vagabond Jews, who are trying to cast out devils in Jesus' name, but they aren't doing it with the right authority, so Paul has to correct them. And then we meet this man named Demetrius, and Demetrius makes a living by creating idols of the goddess Diana or Artemis for people to worship. And Paul comes to town and he starts saying, everyone stop worshiping idols. There's a savior, Jesus Christ. And Demetrius takes that personally because he just lost his whole way of living, of making money. And he gets all the other idol makers together and he starts to try and start this riot. And it works in that a riot is started, but no one really understands what's going on. It's like this weird place. They're like, why are we rioting? We don't know what's going on. And eventually the town clerk is able to come and kind of calm everyone down. And Paul is able to escape. Chapter 20, Paul stays in Greece for 3 months, converts a whole bunch of people. He's going around and preaching some more. While he's preaching in someone's home, this young man named Eutychus is listening to Paul up in the rafters, but he falls asleep and he falls down and he dies. And Paul ends up raising Eutychus from the dead. It is now time for Paul to go to Jerusalem. So he starts traveling. He's sailing even more. He's saying goodbye. He's teaching the elders, and he leaves everyone with a prayer. I think Paul, along with everyone else, knew Jerusalem was going to be an interesting ending point for Paul. There were going to be some stuff going down there. So in chapter 21, our last chapter, Paul is traveling through a lot of cities, trying to go back up to Jerusalem. And he ends up in Caesarea for a couple months, and he meets someone named Philip the Evangelist. And Philip the Evangelist starts to prophesy, and he says, Paul, when you go to Jerusalem, you will be taken and bound by the Jews. You will be put in prison. And Paul has this really interesting interaction where he basically says, bring it on. I can handle that. Let's do it. And he continues to go up to Jerusalem. So Paul is now finishing his third missionary journey. He makes it to Jerusalem. He sees all the elders of the Christian church there, right? And starts to report on his mission and tell everything that's going on. He goes through this purification ceremony that they have at the temple that involves like 7 days being in the temple. And when he emerges from the temple, there is a group of Jews who are ready to capture him. And they actually take him, and their intent is to kill him. But just in the nick of time, the captain, the chief captain there in Jerusalem, who is Greek, the chief captain, he steps in and stops everything that's going on and says, hold on, let me talk to Paul. Let me take this. I'm not going to let this vigilante thing happen. Let's see what's going on. And so at the end of chapter 21, we get this chief captain talking with Paul. Paul kind of explains what's going on and why the Jews in Jerusalem do not like him. See the past couple videos if you need a reminder of why that is. And it ends with Paul convincing this chief captain to let him speak to the Jews. He wants to try and speak to the Jews and kind of clear the air. And that's where we end. We'll see where that takes us with Paul and if he has success speaking to the Jews after this. Okay, hopefully that gives you some clarity on all the details going on this week, because there's a lot. I think one of my favorite points to study this week is in Acts chapter 18. It talks about how the people in the church strengthened each other. And so for my spiritual focus question this week, I want to think about so many times we go to church and we're like, we're thinking about ourselves. We're thinking about ourselves so much. And what if I went to church and I thought, how can I strengthen someone else and not even worry about what I'm getting out of church? Totally focus on serving and strengthening other people in my community. I think that's a cool challenge. All right, have a great week this week and happy studying.